I'm Hannah Brooks, 28, a U.S. Army Staff Sergeant and recipient of the Purple Heart. For years, I tried to be the daughter my father could parade around, covering my achievements in smiles and silence just to earn a scrap of his approval. But when I enlisted, he looked me in the eye and said, "You're nothing but a failure with boots." That was the moment everything changed. Have you ever been dismissed, humiliated, or written off by someone you gave everything to? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I tell you what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being underestimated, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I learned early that love in our house came with conditions. My father measured worth in achievements he could display, like trophies, academic honors, prestigious internships, connections that opened doors to corner offices. I was the daughter who collected dirt under her fingernails and scuff marks on her boots, who talked about serving something larger than myself while my siblings discussed stock portfolios and networking events. Our house sat on 3 acres in Connecticut, the kind of place where neighbors drove German cars and sent their children to prep schools. My father worked in finance, wore Italian suits, and believed success was something you wore for others to see. My mother supported his vision with quiet efficiency, managing our social calendar like a military operation. They threw dinner parties where conversation revolved around who was making partner, whose daughter got into Harvard, which family had bought property in the Hamptons. I tried to fit their mold. I really did. In elementary school, I brought home straight A's and stood perfectly still while my mother fixed my hair for family photos. I smiled at their friends, answered questions about my future with rehearsed responses about law school or business. But even then, something felt wrong. When my father's colleagues asked what I wanted to be when I grew up, I'd catch myself staring out windows, thinking about the flag hanging in my 3rd grade classroom, wondering what it meant to serve your country. By middle school, the cracks were showing. While my older brother excelled at debate team and my younger sister took piano lessons, I gravitated toward different things. I joined the school's community service club, spent weekends volunteering at the local food bank, asked my history teacher extra questions about World War II. My parents tolerated these interests as character-building exercises, assuming I'd outgrow them once real opportunities presented themselves. High school brought the first real conflicts. My siblings followed predictable paths: honor roll, student government, early admission to prestigious universities. I maintained good grades, but found myself drawn to ROTC programs at nearby schools, reading books about military history, talking to veterans at community events. My father would find me researching service academies online and shake his head with disappointment. "Those places are for kids who can't get into real colleges," he'd say, closing my laptop. "You're better than that." But I wasn't better than that. I was different. When my classmates stressed about SAT scores and college applications, I felt called to something else entirely. I started running before dawn, pushing myself through 5-mile loops around our neighborhood. I organized charity drives, led volunteer groups, found myself naturally taking charge when situations required leadership. My father saw these activities as distractions from more important pursuits. The dinner table became a battleground of subtle disappointments. My father would praise my brother's internship at his firm, celebrate my sister's acceptance to an Ivy League school, then turn to me with forced enthusiasm. "And what are your plans, sweetie?" he'd ask, as if my dreams were cute hobbies he was humoring. When I mentioned military service, his smile would freeze. "Let's talk about backup plans," he'd say, steering conversation toward more acceptable topics. I gave everything I had to earn his respect. I maintained a 3.8 GPA, lettered in track and field, won leadership awards he could mention to his friends. I wore the dresses he bought for family events, smiled for photos at his company picnics, played the part of the dutiful daughter who would eventually see reason and choose a proper career. But every gesture felt hollow because I knew what I really wanted, and I knew he'd never approve. The loyalty I offered felt one-sided, like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. I'd watch him beam with pride when my siblings called home with news about internships or academic achievements, then see his expression dim when I mentioned talking to a military recruiter. He'd change the subject quickly, as if my interests were embarrassing topics he preferred to avoid in polite company. My mother tried to bridge the gap between us, suggesting compromises that satisfied no one. Maybe you could join the reserves after college, she'd whisper when my father wasn't around. Or consider the Peace Corps, it's service-oriented but more appropriate. Her words carried love but also resignation, as if she'd already accepted that I'd never quite fit our family's vision of success. Friends started noticing the tension. When they came over for dinner, they'd comment on how different our family conversations were from their own. "Your dad seems really focused on image," my best friend Hannah said after one particularly awkward evening where my father had spent 20 minutes bragging about my brother's job prospects while barely acknowledging my presence. She was right, but hearing it from someone else made the reality sharper. By senior year, the divide felt insurmountable. My siblings were living the dreams my parents had scripted for them, my brother climbing corporate ladders, my sister preparing for medical school. They'd found ways to make our father proud that felt natural to them. I'd found my calling too, but it led in the opposite direction from everything he valued. Military service meant sacrifice over profit, duty over personal gain, collective purpose over individual achievement. I started meeting with recruiters without telling my parents, learning about different branches of service, understanding what commitment really meant. The more I learned, the more certain I became that this was my path. Not because I couldn't succeed in civilian life, but because this felt like the truest expression of who I was meant to be. The kid who wore boots until they fell apart had grown into a young woman who wanted to wear boots in service of something greater. The conversations at home grew more strained. When college acceptance letters arrived, my parents celebrated the options available to me: good schools, respectable programs, pathways to careers they could proudly discuss at their dinner parties. But I kept thinking about the recruiter's words: service isn't for everyone, but for those called to it, nothing else will feel right. I was called to it. I just had to find the courage to answer that call, knowing it would disappoint the man whose approval I'd spent 18 years chasing. That courage was building, one conversation, one recruiter meeting, one sleepless night at a time. I was getting ready to make the choice that would define everything, not just my future, but the relationship with my father that had shaped so much of who I'd become. My father's disappointment had been building toward something larger, and I sensed we were approaching a breaking point that would change everything between us forever. When I started seriously discussing military service, something fundamental shifted in how my father treated me. The cold tolerance I'd grown used to transformed into something more hostile, more personal. It wasn't just disapproval anymore, it was active disdain for choices he considered beneath our family status. The change became obvious during family gatherings. My cousins would update everyone on their career progress, law school acceptances, medical residencies, consulting firm offers, while my father beamed and asked follow-up questions. When conversation turned to me, his enthusiasm evaporated. "She's exploring alternative options," he'd say, as if military service were some phase I'd outgrow once I came to my senses. His comments grew sharper when we were alone. "You're throwing your life away," became his standard response to any mention of enlistment. When I tried to explain my reasons, wanting to serve something larger than myself, believing in duty and honor, he'd wave dismissively. "That's just marketing, honey. They target kids who don't know any better. You're smarter than that." But his criticism wasn't limited to private conversations. At my sister's graduation party, surrounded by family, friends, and colleagues, he made a joke that cut deeper than he probably intended. "3 kids," he announced to the group, "and 2 of them are making us proud." The laughter was uncomfortable, but he continued. "The 3rd one thinks she wants free boots and a paycheck." I smiled and excused myself to the bathroom, where I stared at my reflection and wondered when I'd become the family disappointment. The jokes became a pattern. At dinner parties, he'd entertain guests with stories about my phase, describing my interest in military service like it was teenage rebellion rather than a genuine calling. "She used to want to be a princess," he'd say, "then a veterinarian, now a soldier." Kids, right? The implication was clear. This was just another childish dream I'd abandon once reality set in. My mother tried to defend me in small ways, changing subjects when his comments grew too pointed, but she never directly confronted him. The family dynamic had always revolved around keeping him happy, and my choices were disrupting that balance. I started avoiding family events where I knew he'd perform his routine about his wayward daughter who couldn't appreciate the opportunities she'd been given. School became my refuge. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez, had served in the Navy before becoming a teacher. She understood what I was considering in ways my family never could. Service isn't about running away from better options, she told me during one of our regular meetings. For some people, it's the best option, the one that matches who they are inside. Her words meant more to me than any encouragement I'd received at home. I started spending more time with friends whose families supported their choices, whatever those choices were. Hannah's parents asked genuine questions about military life, treating my interest as valid rather than problematic. Her father, a teacher, said something that stuck with me: the military produces some of the finest leaders in our country. If that's your calling, that's something to be proud of. I wished my own father could see it that way. The distance between us grew more pronounced as my senior year progressed. We'd sit at the same dinner table, but conversation felt forced, artificial. He'd discuss business deals with my brother, medical school preparations with my sister, then ask me perfunctory questions about classes while clearly hoping the topic would shift quickly to something more comfortable. I tried once more to explain my reasoning. We were alone in his study, him reviewing financial reports, me summoning courage for what I hoped would be an honest conversation. "Dad," I began, "I know this isn't what you planned for me, but I need you to understand why this matters." He looked up from his papers with an expression of tired patience. "I want to serve my country. I want to be part of something that matters, something bigger than just making money or climbing corporate ladders. This isn't about running away from success. This is success for me." He listened without interrupting, but I could see in his face that my words weren't reaching him. When I finished, he sighed deeply. "Sweetheart, you're confusing idealism with direction. The military preys on kids who don't understand how the world really works. You think you're signing up for honor and duty, but you're really signing up to take orders from people who weren't smart enough for better careers. Is that really what you want? To be managed by failures who peaked in high school?" His response revealed everything. This wasn't about my future or my happiness, it was about his image, his ability to present a family of winners to his social circle. Military service, in his worldview, was for people who couldn't cut it in the real competition of American capitalism. By choosing service, I was choosing to be a loser, and that reflected poorly on him. I stopped trying to convince him after that conversation. Instead, I focused on the practical steps of enlistment, meeting with recruiters, taking placement tests, preparing for the commitment I knew was right for me. My father's disappointment became background noise to the growing excitement I felt about finally pursuing my true calling. But the background noise was getting louder, more pointed, more personal. I sensed that we were building toward a confrontation that would define our relationship for years to come. The question wasn't whether that confrontation would happen, but when and how devastating it would be. The day I enlisted started like any other, but I knew it would end differently. I'd made my appointment with the recruiter for early afternoon, planning to tell my parents afterward. I wanted the papers signed and the commitment made before anyone could try to talk me out of it. This was my decision, and I was determined to see it through. My father was working from home that day, taking calls in his study while I moved around the house with nervous energy. I kept rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd explain that I'd already made my choice and wasn't asking for permission anymore. I was 18, legally an adult, entitled to make my own decisions about my future. But 18 years of seeking his approval didn't disappear overnight. The recruiter meeting went smoothly. I signed papers, took an oath, committed to a future that felt right in ways nothing else ever had. Walking back to my car, I felt a mixture of pride and terror. I was really doing this. I was becoming a soldier, joining something bigger than myself, accepting a calling that would define the rest of my life. The weight of that commitment felt good, solid, like I was finally moving in the right direction. Driving home, I practiced the conversation again. "Dad, I've enlisted in the Army. I know this isn't what you wanted, but it's what I want, and I need you to respect that decision." Simple, direct, adult. I wasn't asking for his permission anymore, just hoping for his acceptance. I found him in the living room, still in his work clothes, reading something on his tablet. My mother was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The normalcy of the scene made what I was about to say feel surreal. "Dad," I said, sitting across from him, "we need to talk." He looked up with mild curiosity. "What's on your mind, kiddo?" "I enlisted today. I'm joining the army." The words hung in the air between us. His expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, confusion, anger, before settling into something cold and hard. He set down his tablet and looked at me like I was a stranger who'd wandered into his house. "You did what?" "I enlisted. I've been thinking about this for months, and today I made it official. I ship out for basic training in 8 weeks. He stood up, pacing to the window, then turning back to face me. "Without discussing it with us? Without considering how this affects our family? This is my life, Dad. My choice to make. Your choice." His voice was rising now, drawing my mother from the kitchen. "You're 18 years old. You don't know anything about choices or consequences. You've just thrown away every opportunity we've given you, every door we've opened, every sacrifice we've made to position you for success." I stayed calm, or tried to. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing to serve my country. That's not failure, it's honor." "Honor." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think taking orders from high school dropouts who couldn't make it in the real world is honorable? You think being cannon fodder for politicians' games is something to be proud of?" My mother tried to intervene. "Richard, please, let's discuss this calmly." "There's nothing to discuss," he snapped. "She's made her decision. She wants to be a failure. That's her choice." That's when he said it. Looking directly at me, his voice filled with disgust and disappointment, he delivered the words that would end our relationship. "You're nothing but a failure with boots." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt something break inside me, not my resolve, but whatever connection had existed between us. He just reduced everything I was, everything I hoped to become, to those 6 words. A failure with boots. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't try to defend myself or change his mind. I simply stood up, walked to my room, and started packing. 8 weeks until basic training, but I wasn't staying in this house another day. I had friends I could stay with, part-time jobs that would cover basic expenses. I'd figure it out. My mother knocked on my door an hour later, tears in her eyes. "He doesn't mean it," she whispered. "He's just scared for you. Give him time." "No, Mom," I said, folding clothes into a duffel bag. "He means it. And maybe he's right. Maybe I am just a failure with boots. But at least I'll be a failure who's trying to serve something bigger than herself." I left that evening, loading my car with everything that mattered to me. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw my father watching from his study window. Neither of us waved. Neither of us smiled. We both knew this was the end of something that had never really worked anyway. The next 8 weeks passed quickly. I stayed with Hannah's family, worked double shifts at a local restaurant, and prepared mentally for the challenge ahead. I didn't hear from my father. Not a call, not a text, not even a message passed through my mother. His silence spoke louder than his anger had. When I left for basic training, my mother drove me to the bus station. We didn't talk much during the ride, but she hugged me tight before I boarded. "I'm proud of you," she whispered in my ear. "Even if he can't say it, I'm proud of you." I carried those words with me to Fort Benning, along with the echo of my father's voice calling me a failure with boots. One would sustain me through the hardest parts of training. The other would remind me why I could never go back to being the person I'd been before. Deployment was a different kind of education than anything I'd experienced. The heat, the danger, the constant awareness that everything could change in an instant, these things stripped away whatever remained of the sheltered girl who'd grown up in Connecticut suburbs. What emerged was harder, more focused, shaped by purpose and tested by circumstances I could never have imagined. My unit was stationed outside Kandahar, running security operations and working with local communities to establish stable infrastructure. The work was exhausting, sometimes terrifying, but it felt more meaningful than anything I'd ever done. Every day, I saw the direct impact of our presence: schools staying open, supply routes remaining secure, families able to live their lives without constant fear. The soldiers I served with became my family in ways I'd never experienced. We depended on each other completely, trusted each other with our lives, shared everything from rations to fears about what waited for us back home. These weren't the failures my father had described. They were some of the most capable, dedicated, honorable people I'd ever met. Teachers, mechanics, college graduates, kids from farms and cities, all united by a commitment to something larger than themselves. During quiet moments, usually late at night when the desert felt endless around our base, I'd think about my father's words. Failure with boots. The phrase had lost its sting, replaced by a different understanding of what failure actually meant. Failure was living without purpose, taking without giving, choosing comfort over challenge. By that measure, I was succeeding in ways he'd never understand. Letters from home were rare. My mother wrote occasionally, sharing news about my siblings' achievements and carefully avoiding any mention of my father's attitude toward my service. My brother had gotten engaged to a lawyer. My sister was excelling in medical school. Life in Connecticut continued as if I'd never been part of it. I didn't write to my father, and he didn't write to me. The silence stretched across months, then a year, creating a chasm that felt permanent. Sometimes I wondered if he thought about me at all, or if he'd simply erased me from the narrative of his successful family. The explosion happened on a Tuesday morning during what should have been a routine patrol. We were escorting a convoy carrying medical supplies to a rural clinic when the IED detonated 50 meters from our lead vehicle. I was thrown against the side of our transport, feeling something tear in my shoulder and ribs, tasting blood and sand while my ears rang with deafening silence. The medic worked on me while explosions echoed in the distance, secondary devices targeting first responders. Through the haze of shock and adrenaline, I remember thinking that this was what my father had feared, what he'd tried to save me from by calling me a failure. But lying there, watching my fellow soldiers secure the area and protect the convoy, I felt the opposite of failure. I felt proud to be part of something that mattered. Recovery took weeks in a German military hospital, followed by more weeks at Walter Reed. Physical therapy, psychological evaluation, adjustments to a shoulder that would never move quite the same way again. The Purple Heart ceremony was small, held in a hospital conference room with a handful of other wounded soldiers. No family members present, no cameras, no speeches about heroism. Just recognition for service and sacrifice. I didn't send word home about the injury or the commendation. This wasn't about proving anything to my father anymore. The medal represented something between me and my fellow soldiers, between me and the mission we'd served. It wasn't a trophy to display at dinner parties or a talking point for impressing colleagues. It was a reminder of the day I'd been tested and hadn't broken. The pain medication made everything foggy, but one thought remained clear: I'd chosen correctly. Despite the injury, despite the distance from family, despite all the comfortable opportunities I'd walked away from, I'd chosen correctly. The girl who'd worn boots until they fell apart had grown into a soldier who understood what those boots were really for. My confidants during recovery weren't therapists or chaplains, though they helped too. They were the other soldiers sharing similar experiences, people who understood what we'd been through and what we'd carry with us afterward. We didn't talk much about families who didn't understand or parents who'd written us off as failures. We focused on healing, on getting back to our units, on continuing the mission that had brought us together. Months passed. I regained most of my strength, adapted to the limitations in my shoulder, prepared for my return to active duty. The medal stayed in my dresser drawer, not hidden but not displayed either. It represented one day in a career of service, one moment in a life dedicated to something larger than personal achievement. I still thought about my father sometimes, wondered if he knew about my injury, if he cared about what I'd experienced. But those thoughts came less frequently as I built a life around people who valued action over image, substance over appearance, service over self-interest. I was becoming the person I'd always wanted to be, even if she bore no resemblance to the daughter he'd wanted to raise. The distance between us felt permanent now, not just geographical but fundamental. We'd chosen different definitions of success, different measures of worth, different ways of moving through the world. There was no bridge across that divide, no common ground where we could meet and understand each other. I was at peace with that reality, or thought I was. I'd stopped chasing his approval, stopped measuring myself against his expectations. But some part of me, buried deep beneath the discipline and self-reliance I'd cultivated, still carried the memory of that 18-year-old girl who'd just wanted her father to be proud of her. That part would be tested sooner than I expected. The decision to stop pursuing my father's approval wasn't dramatic, it was gradual, like water wearing away stone. Each day of silence from home, each letter that arrived for other soldiers while none came for me, each holiday that passed without contact, reinforced the reality that I'd been written out of his story. I learned to be okay with that, or at least to function despite it. Military life provided structure that civilian relationships had never offered. Orders were clear, expectations were stated directly, and success was measured by performance rather than perception. I thrived in that environment. My shoulder limited some activities, but I adapted, finding ways to contribute that played to my strengths rather than my limitations. Leadership noticed, and I began taking on increased responsibilities. The community I found among fellow soldiers filled spaces I hadn't realized were empty. We shared experiences that civilians couldn't understand, the weight of real responsibility, the clarity that comes from having your life depend on other people's confidence, the satisfaction of serving something larger than personal ambition. These weren't relationships built on small talk or social climbing. They were forged in shared purpose and tested under pressure. I started sending letters to my mother more regularly, sharing carefully edited versions of my experiences that wouldn't worry her too much. She responded with news from home, but her letters revealed the careful editing too. My siblings were progressing in their careers. My father was doing well at work. Everyone was healthy. The subtext was clear, life was continuing without me, and that was probably for the best. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I'd chosen differently, if I'd accepted one of those college offers and followed a path he could approve of. Law school, maybe, or business like my brother. I could picture that version of myself, wearing suits instead of uniforms, discussing mergers instead of missions, building a resume instead of character. The image felt foreign, like imagining someone else's life entirely. My transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal, fundamental. The girl who'd spent 18 years seeking external validation had become a woman who generated her own sense of worth. I measured success by the trust my unit placed in me, by the missions we completed successfully, by the difference we made in places where difference was desperately needed. Those metrics felt more honest than anything I'd learned at family dinner tables. The scars weren't just physical. I'd been changed by violence, by loss, by responsibility for other people's safety. But I'd also been changed by purpose, by belonging to something that mattered, by proving to myself that I could handle whatever challenges arose. The girl who'd wanted free boots and a paycheck, as my father had put it, had become a soldier who understood the true cost of freedom. Years passed. I was promoted, took on new roles, saw different parts of the world. My mother's letters mentioned family gatherings I wasn't part of, celebrations where my absence was noted but not mourned. My father had found ways to discuss his children's achievements without mentioning the one who'd chosen service over success. I was becoming a family ghost, present in memory but absent from current reality. The medals accumulated, not just the Purple Heart, but commendations for leadership, for service, for achievements that would have meant nothing to my father, but meant everything to the people who served alongside me. I kept them in a simple box, not displayed but not forgotten either. They represented moments when I'd been tested and found worthy, when I'd contributed to missions larger than myself. I wasn't bitter about the estrangement, at least not consciously. I'd made my choice and accepted its consequences. But deep down, some part of me still carried the hurt of his rejection, the echo of those words that had ended our relationship. "You're nothing but a failure with boots." The phrase had lost its power to wound, but it hadn't lost its clarity. It represented everything he'd never understood about my choice, everything he'd never tried to understand. Building a life without his approval had been liberating, but also lonely in ways I didn't fully acknowledge. I had brothers and sisters in arms, mentors and colleagues who respected my service, a community that valued what I contributed. But I didn't have a father who was proud of me, and that absence shaped everything else, even when I pretended it didn't matter. I told myself I'd moved beyond needing his validation, that I'd found something better than his conditional love. Most days, I believed that. But occasionally, in quiet moments between missions or during holidays spent on base, I'd catch myself wondering what it would be like to have a father who saw my service as something worthy of respect rather than something to be ashamed of. Those moments of vulnerability were rare, pushed down by the discipline and self-reliance that military life demanded. I had work to do, people who depended on me, missions that required my full attention. Personal relationships that didn't support that mission became secondary, including the relationship with a father who'd made it clear that my choices disappointed him. I was building something new, a life defined by service rather than approval, by action rather than image, by substance rather than appearance. It was a good life, meaningful and challenging and filled with people who understood what I was trying to accomplish. If it wasn't the life my father had wanted for me, that was his loss, not mine. But fate has a way of testing our resolve, of bringing us face to face with parts of ourselves we thought we'd left behind. I didn't know it yet, but a family gathering was approaching that would force me to confront both the woman I'd become and the girl who still, somewhere inside, wanted her father to be proud of her. The family pressure started subtly, the way it always did. My mother's letters began including casual mentions of upcoming events, my cousin's wedding, my sister's medical school graduation, the annual charity gala my father's company hosted. It would be wonderful if you could make it, she'd write, as if my absence from these gatherings was a scheduling conflict rather than a deliberate choice. I was stationed stateside now, close enough to make the trip if I wanted to. My commanding officer encouraged leave time, recognizing that even the most dedicated soldiers needed to maintain family connections. "You've been carrying a lot of responsibility," he said during one of our regular check-ins. "A few days with family might be good for you." If only he knew how complicated family had become. The gala invitation arrived with my name printed in elegant script, as if I'd been included in the family all along. My mother must have added me to the guest list despite knowing I hadn't spoken to my father in years. Inside the invitation was a handwritten note, "Please consider coming." It would mean so much to have all my children there together. I stared at that note for a long time, weighing the desire to see my mother against the certainty of facing my father's disapproval. The girl I'd been would have agonized over the decision, would have spent weeks imagining different scenarios and outcomes. The woman I'd become made the choice more quickly. I would go, but on my own terms. The decision to wear my dress uniform wasn't about confrontation, it was about honesty. This was who I'd become, what I'd chosen, the life I'd built despite his objections. If he was ashamed of having a soldier for a daughter, that was his problem to manage. I wasn't going to pretend to be someone else just to make a family gathering more comfortable. The drive to Connecticut felt like traveling backward through time. Everything looked exactly as I remembered, the manicured neighborhoods, the pristine lawns, the sense that appearance mattered more than substance. I'd grown used to environments where function trumped form, where what you did mattered more than how you looked doing it. This felt foreign now, like visiting a country whose customs I'd forgotten. The gala was being held at the country club my father had belonged to for decades, the same place where he'd brought clients to discuss deals and brought family to display his success. I sat in my car for several minutes before going inside, adjusting my uniform, checking that the Purple Heart was positioned correctly among my other ribbons. Whatever happened tonight, I would face it as the person I'd become. Inside, the party was exactly what I'd expected, men in expensive suits discussing market trends, women in designer dresses comparing vacation plans, conversations that revolved around wealth and status rather than purpose or meaning. I recognized some faces from childhood, people who'd known me as the awkward daughter who didn't quite fit the family image. Their surprise at seeing me in uniform was poorly concealed. My mother found me first, tears in her eyes as she hugged me tightly. "You came," she whispered, as if she doubted I would follow through. "You look beautiful. Official. Like someone important." I was someone important, just not in ways this crowd would recognize or value. My siblings greeted me warmly but carefully, sensing the potential for drama. My brother, now a successful investment banker, introduced me to his fiancée with obvious pride. My sister, nearly finished with medical school, asked genuine questions about military life that showed she'd been thinking about me even during our years of separation. They'd both found ways to succeed that satisfied our father while remaining true to themselves. I envied them that balance. But it was my father I was there to see, even if I couldn't admit that to myself. I found him across the room, surrounded by colleagues and clients, holding court with stories about his successful children. Even from a distance, I could see him in his element, confident, charming, every inch the successful businessman who'd earned his place among the community's elite. I didn't approach immediately. Instead, I watched him work the room, noting how easily he commanded attention, how naturally he occupied space that others deferred to. Whatever else I thought about him, he was genuinely skilled at this world he'd chosen. He'd found his calling just as surely as I'd found mine. The tragedy was that our callings led in opposite directions. The moment came when I was talking to my aunt about my service, explaining some of the humanitarian work we'd done overseas. I saw him notice me from across the room, saw recognition dawn on his face as he realized who he was looking at. For just an instant, his composure slipped, and I saw something, surprise, confusion, maybe even something that looked like pride before he recovered his social mask. He excused himself from his conversation and walked toward me with the measured steps of someone preparing for a difficult encounter. The room seemed to quiet around us, as if everyone sensed the significance of this reunion. I straightened my shoulders, checked my posture, and prepared to face the man whose approval I'd stopped seeking, but whose opinion still mattered more than I wanted to admit. This was the moment I'd been building toward without realizing it, the test of everything I'd become, everything I'd chosen, everything I'd sacrificed to build a life of purpose rather than approval. In a few seconds, we'd be face to face for the first time in years, and I'd discover whether the woman I'd become was strong enough to stand her ground in the face of the man whose rejection had shaped so much of who I was. He walked toward me carrying his usual confidence, but I could see something different in his eyes, uncertainty, maybe even nervousness. This wasn't the controlled environment of our family home, where he could dismiss my choices with a wave of his hand. This was his professional world, surrounded by people who knew him as a successful businessman with successful children, and I was wearing a uniform that declared a different kind of success. "Hello, Dad," I said when he reached me, keeping my voice steady and professional. "Hannah," he replied, my name sounding formal in his mouth. "I didn't expect to see you here. Mom invited me. I had leave available." We stood there for a moment, sizing each other up like opponents preparing for a match. He looked older than I remembered, with more gray in his hair and deeper lines around his eyes. Success had treated him well, but age was beginning to show. I wondered what changes he saw in me, the confidence that came from real responsibility, the scars that came from real danger, the calm that came from knowing who I was and what I stood for. His eyes moved over my uniform, taking in the ribbons and decorations I'd earned through service. I watched him trying to process what he was seeing, trying to reconcile the failure with boots he dismissed years ago with the professional soldier standing in front of him. The Purple Heart was clearly visible on my chest, and I saw his gaze linger there with something that might have been recognition. "You look." He started, then stopped, as if unsure how to complete the sentence. "Professional? Competent? Like someone who'd proven him wrong." "You look well," he finally said. "Thank you. I am well." One of his colleagues approached, a man I vaguely remembered from childhood gatherings. "Richard, aren't you going to introduce us to this distinguished service member?" he asked, clearly assuming I was someone my father was proud to present. The pause that followed lasted only seconds, but it felt much longer. I could see my father calculating, trying to decide how to handle this situation in front of people whose opinions mattered to his business. He could acknowledge me as his daughter and implicitly validate choices he'd spent years criticizing, or he could fumble through some awkward explanation that preserved his narrative about his successful family. "This is my daughter, Hannah," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "She serves in the army." The colleague's face lit up with genuine respect. "Outstanding. What's your rank, if you don't mind my asking?" "Staff Sergeant," I replied, noting how my father's expression tightened slightly. In his world, that probably sounded like middle management rather than leadership. "And that Purple Heart, where did you earn that?" "Afghanistan. IED attack during a convoy escort mission." The conversation that followed was surreal. My father stood silently while his colleague asked detailed questions about my service, my deployments, my experiences overseas. Other people joined the group, drawn by curiosity about the soldier in their midst. They treated me with the kind of respect I'd grown used to in military circles, but had never experienced in my father's social world. "You must be incredibly proud," someone said to my father. "Having a daughter who's willing to serve her country, who's been wounded in action, that takes real courage." "Yes," my father said, his voice tight. "Very proud." But I could see the truth in his eyes. He wasn't proud, he was trapped. Trapped between his genuine feelings about my choices and the social expectations of people who viewed military service as honorable rather than shameful. For the first time in our relationship, the context was working in my favor rather than his. The group eventually dispersed, leaving us alone again. The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of unresolved conflict and disappointment. I wasn't sure what I'd expected from this encounter, but it wasn't this awkward standoff where neither of us seemed to know what to say. "You've done well for yourself," he said eventually, the words sounding forced. "I've done what felt right to me," I replied. "What I needed to do." "And the injury, you're fully recovered?" "Mostly. Some limitations, but nothing that prevents me from doing my job." He nodded, looking uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. This was the part he'd feared when I enlisted, the possibility of injury, of loss, of sacrifice that served abstract principles rather than concrete gain. But I'd survived it, had even been recognized for it, and that complicated his narrative about my poor judgment. "Your mother missed you," he said, shifting to safer ground. "She talks about you often." "I missed her too. I'm glad I could make it tonight. The family gatherings haven't been the same without you." It was the closest thing to an admission that my absence had mattered to him, but it wasn't quite an apology or an acknowledgement that he'd been wrong. I wasn't sure what I wanted from him anymore, recognition, regret, or just the simple acceptance that I'd chosen a valid path even if it wasn't the path he'd wanted for me. We talked for a few more minutes about neutral topics, my siblings' progress, changes in the neighborhood, his work, before the conversation died natural death. Neither of us had the tools to bridge the gap that separated us, and neither seemed willing to admit fault or seek forgiveness. We were two people who'd once been family, now reduced to polite strangers making awkward small talk at a social event. When he excused himself to return to his hosting duties, I felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. I'd faced him as the person I'd become, had held my ground without apologizing for my choices, had even earned grudging acknowledgement of my service. But we hadn't reconnected, hadn't found common ground, hadn't healed the wounds that his words had opened years ago. I spent the rest of the evening talking with other family members, catching up with cousins and aunts and uncles who seemed genuinely happy to see me. Some asked about my service with real curiosity and respect. Others clearly didn't know what to make of my choices, but were polite enough to avoid saying anything judgmental. The overall reception was warmer than I'd expected, reminding me that my father's opinions weren't shared by everyone in our extended family. As the evening wound down, I prepared to leave without any dramatic confrontation or emotional reconciliation. This hadn't been about proving anything to my father, it had been about proving something to myself. I'd returned to his world wearing the uniform I'd earned, representing the life I'd chosen, comfortable with who I'd become. His approval or disapproval no longer had the power to define my worth. But as I walked toward the exit, I heard him behind me, talking to another group of colleagues and clients. His voice carried across the room as he fell back into the familiar rhythm of boasting about his successful children. My brother's promotion, my sister's upcoming residency, the achievements he could display like trophies to demonstrate his parenting success. I paused near the door, listening despite myself, waiting to see if he'd mention me at all, or if I'd remain the invisible daughter whose choices were too embarrassing to acknowledge. The answer would tell me everything I needed to know about whether anything had changed between us, whether this encounter had shifted his understanding of my service even slightly. What happened next would define not just our relationship, but my own sense of closure about the girl I'd been and the woman I'd become. I hadn't planned to eavesdrop, but his voice carried clearly across the room as he settled into his familiar routine. The group around him was different now: senior partners from his firm, potential clients, people whose opinions could impact his business relationships. This was his element, the performance he'd perfected over decades of networking and social climbing. 3 children, he was saying, the same opening line I'd heard countless times growing up. All of them making their mark in the world. I should have kept walking toward the exit, should have let him tell whatever version of our family story served his purposes. But something kept me rooted there, listening to see if the conversation we'd just had changed anything about how he presented his successful offspring. My eldest, Richard Jr., just made partner at Goldman Sachs. Youngest ever in his division. My daughter Jennifer is finishing her residency at Johns Hopkins, neurosurgery, very competitive field. Going to make a real difference in people's lives. The pause that followed felt familiar. This was usually where he'd make some dismissive comment about his other child, or where he'd smoothly transition to discussing business or golf or anything that kept the focus on achievements he could be proud of. I waited, curious despite myself about how he'd handle the elephant in the room. "And your third child?" someone prompted, clearly expecting the pattern to continue. Another pause, longer this time. I could picture him holding his drink, calculating the best way to handle this question in front of people who'd just met his soldier daughter, people who'd expressed genuine respect for military service. "My youngest daughter serves in the army," he said finally. "Staff sergeant. Just returned from Afghanistan." It wasn't quite pride, but it wasn't dismissal either. Progress, maybe, or at least acknowledgement that pretending I didn't exist was no longer sustainable in mixed company. But I sensed there was more coming, some qualifier that would restore balance to his narrative. "Must be challenging," one of the clients said. "Having a child in harm's way, worrying about their safety." "Yes, it's been difficult. We didn't expect that path when she was younger. She was always so bright, had opportunities in law, business, academia. But she felt called to service, I suppose. Different kind of achievement than what we'd imagined for her." There it was, the careful reframing that acknowledged my choice while preserving his belief that it represented settling for less than my potential. I was bright enough for better things, but had chosen service instead, as if the two were mutually exclusive. In his worldview, I'd succeeded despite my poor judgment rather than because of it. "The Purple Heart is significant," another voice added. "That represents real sacrifice." "Yes, she was injured in an explosion. IED attack during a convoy mission. We're grateful she recovered as well as she did." I listened to him describe my injury and recovery with clinical detachment, as if recounting something that had happened to someone else's daughter. There was no emotion in his voice, no indication that my deployment had caused him sleepless nights or that my injury had frightened him. Just facts delivered in the same tone he'd used to discuss quarterly earnings or market fluctuations. "You must be incredibly proud," someone said, echoing the comment from earlier in the evening. Military service takes real character. And combat deployment, that's serious responsibility. This was the moment I'd been waiting for without realizing it. Not the conversation we'd had face-to-face, which had been too careful and controlled to reveal much, but this unguarded moment when he thought I wasn't listening. His answer would tell me everything about whether anything fundamental had changed in how he viewed my service. "Pride is complicated," he said slowly. "She's accomplished things, certainly. Been recognized for her service. But as a parent, you always wonder about the path not taken, you know? The opportunities that were available, the different directions a life could have gone." The words hit me like a physical blow. After everything, the years of silence, the deployment, the injury, the commendations, the respectful questions from his colleagues tonight, he still saw my service as a disappointment, still believed I'd chosen poorly when better options were available. The girl who'd wanted free boots and a paycheck had become a decorated soldier, and he still couldn't see that transformation as success. I turned away from the conversation and walked toward the exit, processing what I'd just heard. Part of me felt vindicated. I'd been right to stop seeking his approval, right to build a life independent of his expectations. But part of me felt grief for the relationship we'd never had, for the father who couldn't see his daughter's service as something worthy of genuine pride. The valet brought my car around, and I sat in the parking lot for several minutes before driving away. The conversation I'd overheard clarified something important. This wasn't about me proving myself to him anymore. I'd done that already, had earned recognition and respect from people whose opinions mattered in contexts that counted. His inability to see that was his limitation, not my failure. As I drove back toward my hotel, I thought about the colleagues who'd expressed genuine respect for my service, about the conversation that had positioned me as someone accomplished rather than someone who'd settled for less. In any context outside our family dysfunction, my military career represented achievement and honor. Only in my father's narrow worldview did it represent disappointment. The girl who'd left home in anger and hurt had returned as a woman confident in her choices and comfortable with the life she'd built. If that woman still felt a pang of sadness about her father's inability to appreciate her service, that was natural. But it wasn't devastating anymore. I'd found pride and purpose in places that mattered more than family dinner conversations. Tomorrow, I'd drive back to my base, return to my duties, continue serving alongside people who understood what that service meant. Tonight had been about closing a circle, not about reopening old wounds. I'd faced the man whose rejection had once defined me, and I'd discovered that his opinion no longer had the power to diminish who I'd become. The story that had begun with a father calling his daughter a failure with boots was ending with that daughter realizing she'd never been the failure in that relationship. The drive back to base gave me time to process what had happened, to understand what the evening had accomplished and what it had revealed. I'd gone to the gala hoping for some kind of resolution with my father, some acknowledgement that I'd built a life worth respecting even if it wasn't the life he'd wanted for me. Instead, I discovered that the resolution I needed wasn't something he could give me, it was something I'd already given myself. The uniform I'd worn wasn't about confronting him or proving him wrong. It was about being honest about who I'd become, refusing to hide or apologize for choices that had shaped me into someone I could respect. The fact that his colleagues had treated me with genuine respect while he remained conflicted said everything about the difference between his personal disappointments and the objective value of military service. I thought about the conversation I'd overheard, his comment about pride being complicated. In some ways, I understood his perspective. Parents invest years imagining their children's futures, and when those children choose different paths, adjustment takes time. But it had been years since I'd enlisted, years since I'd proven that military service wasn't about running away from better opportunities, but about running towards something meaningful. His inability to see that distinction was his failure, not mine. I'd offered him multiple chances to understand my choices, had given him years to observe the person I'd become through service. If he still saw my achievements as consolation prizes rather than genuine accomplishments, that reflected his limitations rather than my shortcomings. The Purple Heart on my chest represented one day when I'd been tested under the worst possible circumstances and had performed my duties despite injury and danger. It wasn't a participation trophy or a sympathy award, it was recognition for sacrifice in service of something larger than myself. The fact that his colleagues understood that while he remained ambivalent said everything about whose opinion actually mattered. I'd learned something important tonight. I no longer needed his validation to feel complete. The girl who'd left home seeking approval had been replaced by a woman who generated her own sense of worth through service, leadership, and commitment to principles that transcended personal comfort. That transformation was my greatest achievement, regardless of whether he could recognize it. The weeks that followed were routine, training exercises, administrative duties, the steady rhythm of military life that had become comfortable and familiar. I didn't write to my mother about the gala, didn't try to process the encounter through family channels that would inevitably lead back to him. Instead, I focused on my responsibilities, my soldiers, the mission we served together. But I found myself thinking differently about family, about the relationships that define us and the ones we outgrow. Military service had given me a chosen family of people who understood sacrifice and commitment, who measured worth through character rather than achievement. That family had sustained me through deployment, injury, and recovery. It was enough. The medal stayed in my dresser drawer, not because I was ashamed of it, but because its significance was personal rather than public. It represented a moment when I'd been tested and hadn't broken, when I'd continued serving despite pain and fear. That was between me and the mission, between me and the people I'd served alongside. It didn't need external validation to maintain its meaning. Months passed without contact from my father. My mother wrote occasionally, sharing family news that felt increasingly distant from my daily reality. My siblings were progressing in their careers, building lives that fit the template our parents had provided. I was happy for their success, but it felt like watching strangers whose achievements existed in a different world from mine. I was promoted to Sergeant First Class, recognizing leadership abilities that had developed through years of real responsibility. The ceremony was small, just my unit, my commanding officer, a few colleagues who'd become friends. No family members present, but that felt appropriate. This achievement belonged to the community that had supported and challenged me, not to the family that had never understood what I was working toward. The promotion came with increased responsibilities, training younger soldiers, managing complex logistics, making decisions that affected people's lives and mission success. It was demanding work, but it felt natural, like I'd found the role I was meant to fill. The girl who'd wanted to serve something larger than herself had become a woman trusted with genuine authority in service of that goal. Late at night, when the base was quiet and I had time to think, I sometimes reflected on the path that had brought me here. The anger and hurt that had driven me away from home had been transformed into purpose and strength. The father who'd called me a failure had inadvertently pushed me toward the life where I'd found my truest success. There was irony in that transformation, but no bitterness. His rejection had hurt, but it had also freed me to pursue my actual calling without the burden of seeking approval for choices he'd never understand. In some perverse way, his disapproval had been a gift. It had forced me to find validation in places that mattered more than family gatherings and dinner party conversations. The woman I'd become could appreciate that irony without resenting the pain that had created it. I'd been tested by combat, by injury, by responsibility for other people's lives. Being tested by a father's disappointment felt manageable by comparison. I'd survived worse things and emerged stronger. As my second deployment approached, I felt ready for whatever challenges waited overseas. Not because I had something to prove, I'd already proven everything that mattered, but because I'd found work that aligned with who I was meant to be. The boots I wore carried me toward purposes larger than personal achievement, and that felt right in ways that no other path ever could. The girl who'd left home as a failure with boots was returning to combat as a leader of soldiers, a protector of missions, a guardian of principles worth fighting for. That transformation was its own vindication, regardless of who could recognize it and who could not. That was my story of being called a failure with boots and later standing tall with a purple heart on my chest. What about you? Have you ever had someone doubt you, only to prove them wrong in the end? How did it feel when they finally saw the truth? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your experiences. And if you've ever had to set boundaries or rise above someone's expectations, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about resilience and self-worth.